To begin with, can you explain what is a guardrail?
A guardrail is a guidepost. It helps us in our decision making. I mean, we make lots of decisions every day, literally thousands of them, but some of them are really consequential. And if we make the wrong decision, that could have huge consequences. That could mean difference between life and death. And so making good decisions is really helpful. And having somebody that can provide some guidance on how to make good decisions is even better.
Wonderful. So I like the idea of tools to help you make decisions. So can you give me some examples of how guardrails might be used in a business context?
Sure. But let me give you an example of what a good guardrail is first, outside of the business context, just so that you understand and the listeners understand what's the difference between a good guardrail that's flexible enough and adaptable enough and something that's really not good. So a really good guardrail is, for example, the rule that we should drive on the right side of the road if you're in North America, or on the left side of the road if you're in the UK. That's a guardrail. It helps us avoid accidents. It's hugely efficient and beneficial, but we can break that guardrail if we want to. For example, when we want to overtake a car and there's no other car coming our way, we can actually change to the other side and overtake that car. The real good guardrail helps us, guides us in our decision making, but we are still in the driver's seat. We still make the decisions. It doesn't nanny us. It doesn't tell us what we do. It empowers us to make good decisions, but it doesn't go beyond that. That's a good guardrail. So in the business context, for example, if we now bring it back to the business context, a good guardrail is one that helps the manager, that helps an organization to reach its goals, to reach its aims. That may come in all kinds of forms and shapes. Standard operating procedures in companies are guardrails. In fact, standard operating procedures in airplanes are guardrails too. And pilots should keep to the standard operating procedures, but there are exceptional circumstances where they can break them. And the same is true in the business context, of course, as well.
Okay, so it sounds like there's quite a range then from just sort of simple rules of thumb in order to give you good advice through to processes and procedures up to, I guess, do laws count as guardrails as well?
Absolutely. And some laws are quite strict and you can only do a certain thing, and other laws are quite flexible as well. And keep in mind, there's a law that we cannot speed on the highway beyond, in the US, 55 or 65 or sometimes 75 miles per hour. But we can still speed. We just have to live with the consequences of a speeding ticket, for example. In other words, that is a pretty good guardrail because it contains and it has that flexibility built in. And similarly, in a commercial context, a good guardrail helps decision makers, but doesn't disempower them, doesn't take decision power away from them.
Okay, so it's like, this is a really good idea, but you have the freedom to break it if you deem fit. Okay.
Exactly.
You mentioned that sometimes making decisions can be a life or death situation. Do you have any examples where a lack of guardrails has caused some sort of problem?
Yes, and if you forgive me, I'll offer an example of from the aviation history again. We open our book Guardrails with this very stark story. It's about 20-some years ago. At that time, there was a new device, or relatively new device, that was built into commercial airliners to avoid head-on collisions. It was a collision warning system, and these two boxes in two airplanes that got too close to each other, they would negotiate, and one would order the crew to ascend and the other would order the other crew to descend, thereby avoiding the head-on crash. And when these boxes came around, initially there was no good guardrail, no good rule that mandated that pilots in all or almost all circumstances should follow the directive of the machine to avoid the collision. And so two airplanes over the Swiss-German border got very close to each other. Both had those boxes in there, but only one airline had a standard operating procedure, and the pilots complied with it and thereby descended. The other side did not believe the machine, did not have standard operating procedures, not guardrails in place, descended as well, a crash, and 100 people died.
That's about as bad as it gets in terms of outcomes there. So that's a pretty tragic event. So yeah, I can certainly see having a procedure and making sure that other people are following that procedure as well can be incredibly important. All right, I think we need a happier story to balance this. So, do you have any examples of when guardrails have been helpful and there's been a positive outcome?
Absolutely, and you see already as I'm drawing in examples from the aviation industry, from automobiles and driving all the way to the commercial context, guardrails really are everywhere. One of the happy outcomes, in a way, with respect to guardrails is from Africa, where there are oftentimes contested resources, just like water. And in West Africa, a number of small nations depended on the Volta River water supply, but some nations took more water than the others. And so they came together and in a very inclusive process came up with guardrails, with a framework on how to divvy up that limited resource and then ran by it. It was not a fixed framework. It was somewhat flexible. It also needed to be adapted to changing uses and changing context and also climate change, of course. But overall, it was a very positive story as it enabled not just a limited number of people to get access to good water, but a very large group of people that transcended a particular jurisdiction or a particular nation.